Hello, this is Darren Pulsifer, Chief Solution Architect of Public Sector at Intel, and welcome to Embracing Digital Transformation, where we investigate effective change leveraging people, process, and technology. On today's episode, Application and Workload Portfolios in Cloud Migration with special guest Sarah Musick, Cloud Solution Architect at Intel. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Darren. Thanks for having me.
Hey, you've been on the show, twice before? Or maybe three times? Twice.
Twice.
In a big group and then individually. We've talked to you before about your role at Intel and the great insight that you have. Welcome back. Thank
you. Yeah, good to be back.
All right. Now, Sarah, tell our audience a little bit about your background, and then we'll dive right into this episode around application and workload portfolios and cloud.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to work my way backward, but I'm a cloud solution architect at Intel. So for the data center group inside of sales and marketing, and that's a blast. We have a wonderful, wonderful group of cloud solution architects
you guys
assembled.
Really do.
Yeah, with a wide variety of backgrounds, which makes it really exciting because the cloud's a vast, expansive opportunity for customers. But to address that effectively, we have to have a wide sort of girth of backgrounds, which we do, which is nice. So I came from a professional services and software group who does cloud consulting for migration in particular and optimization. So especially where there's technical debt, some of the portfolio rationalization that goes into, really addressing some of that technical debt. And so there's kind of an analytics component to it, but also there's a hardcore, cloud and management component to it. I live in the Southeast. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. So before that, I worked for regional SIs that are pretty well known here in the South. So, vinegar-based barbecue forever. And it's so good. Yeah, right. So, that's, essentially my background. That's how I started in tech, is working for regional SIs, and my schooling's actually in classical music. So shout out to the folks who have a performing arts or liberal arts background.
Okay, all right, wait. I did not know. Wait, I do know that about you, right? You sang, right?
Yes, yeah, I still do as a hobby. Mm-hmm.
Oh, that is so wonderful. I come from a musical family as well. I was not gifted in the musical talents, but my children all are. So awesome. It's awesome. I love hearing my kids perform. They know how to make me cry. They say, "Dad, are you going to come to my performance? Here's a box of tissue paper," right? I mean, that's,
I love that. That's so great.
That's awesome, Sarah. I'm glad you have such wonderful talents and you still share them. All right, let's dive into, because we heard from Rajiv in the previous podcast around, he mentioned, hey, you've got to understand your applications. You have to understand your workloads. And he goes, Sarah's going to talk to us about that. So it's your turn, Sarah. I mean, we've got to understand our applications and workloads to do any kind of cloud work.
That's right. Yeah. So that opens up a wide expanse of potential pitfalls, but also opportunities. So, one of the biggest things that I see in cloud is that there's this bifurcated attitude of cloud consumption and also cloud strategy. And that bifurcated attitude is the folks who feel fairly secure about the fact that they're cloud native. And so they've been in the cloud, they architected in the cloud. Maybe there haven't been data center dependencies in the past, but if there have been, they've largely architected away from those. And then there are organizations that have a true hybrid strategy who rely on the data center, and for really good reasons, because their workloads are better fit for the data center, who have cloud footprints, sometimes for, quite a while, but there's lingering technical debt that's never been addressed. So that's a piece of the application landscape, but the complexion of applications can be a little deceptive in a maybe an elusive kind of way. So
how so? I mean,
mm-hmm.
Yeah, how so? Because I mean, we heard in other episodes around cloud that people get surprised when they move their workloads to the
They
cloud.
do all the time. Yeah.
But
So
where
I
does that
think
surprise come from? What are you seeing when that happens? What are the key things that people get surprised about?
one I would say is, and I was thinking about this knowing that we were going to have this conversation, is the political capital that an application carries versus its actual weight in the organization. So it's what one of my dear colleagues calls mop and bucket work. Mop and bucket work is the work that people don't pay attention to until it doesn't work anymore. And then suddenly there's a fire drill. So applications that are typically external facing the customer, a lot of times they have slicker UIs, and so a web component where customers are able to manipulate data. A lot of those are applications that typically carry a lot of political capital, but aren't necessarily, if you think about it from the standpoint of driving the base health of the business. They may transact on the app, and so obviously that's important, but there are a lot of applications that are relatively small in footprint that if something happens with them, or if they're not adequately paid attention to, can actually have an outsized effect on the organization.
I actually ran into that problem myself when I was a CIO. We had an external customer facing app. It was small. I thought nothing of it. I focused all of our time on our back office, and we pushed an update out to the front end application, and we got a DDoS attack at the same time, and we did not handle it well. We fell down.
That's
And
tough. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that's where I got all my white hair that one day, because the business was shut down. And it was a very much online, almost like e-commerce, but not really. But all of our business relied on this one app. So I love the concept of political capital that an application has. I never thought of it before until you brought that up, and I said, "Yeah, I've made that mistake in a
Yeah.
huge way." So
I think
that's
it's
great.
only, yeah, it's only human. I, can think of an example of an organization that I worked with, and the application wasn't super large, but it was the connective tissue between headquarters and some of the remote sites. And it had to do with pushing updates for SKUs in terms of what was available coming from the factories. And it was a discrete
Oh,
application that they'd written themselves. And so it wasn't just, something that they could do through SAP, because industry specific needs that were being addressed in the internal, right? And they hadn't been paying a lot of attention, and so I kind of called through the data and found out, as another colleague of mine said, this is a smoking hole waiting to happen. And because the remote sites have to be able to do work. They have to be able to carry out their day to day. So
so these hidden applications kind of surface when you start doing an assessment and you start looking at applications and workloads through the organization, which
mhm.
should be one of the first steps that you do in a cloud migration, or when you start looking at your strategy and implementing it. Um, it could be scary. Maybe you don't want to know these things.
Yeah, rational it is, and so I would offer that up as sort of a point of reassurance that pretty universally app rationalization can be, and portfolio rationalization can be a little unnerving. But I look at it like working out, or going to the doctor. You're not necessarily saying anything's wrong, but what you're doing is making sure that the health of the organization stays put. And so a lot of that work, you know it's painful and it takes man hours, and that's why a lot of folks don't maybe
Don't
spend
do
more
it.
time with it than they could.
So it sounds to me like it almost has to be. It's not a one-time thing. It sounds like it's a big project and it might be continuous, right? Because you can't do everything at once. You're going to have to prioritize which ones you're going after
Yeah.
first. So these are long.
seasons.
These are like multi-year type of programs.
Often, yeah, and you can have sort of boilerplate 6-month, uh, sort of rip the band-aid off type engagements, and I've seen real success with that approach sometimes when the team decides to just kind of sit down and do the work until they're done and then they get up from the table, so to speak. But not everybody has that luxury, and some of it depends on what winds are blowing, tail or headwinds for the organization. So yeah.
All right, so let's talk about categorizing applications and workloads too, because workloads are how applications are interacting and humans involved in there. What are some of the things I'm looking for prioritizing or categorizing these so I know how do I start building my roadmap out? I can't do them all at once. I have limited budget.
Yeah.
So what key factors do you use when you're helping organizations go through that process?
Yeah. Well, there are the pure technical ones, and I'll start with those. But I think business direction is becoming increasingly important. So as non-technical personas weigh in on technical decisions, so CIO or CEOs are actually having more and more to say about what's going on technically. That can be tough, but that can also be wonderful because you finally have the ear of somebody in the past who there have been some Gartner numbers that have come out of that, and specifically with regard to mergers and acquisitions, that something like 75% of CEOs recognize that the technical component of the merger or the acquisition or the divestment is going to have a real kind of bearing on the success. But so starting with the technical, if anybody has gone through a discovery assessment or a discovery activity within the organization, and by that I mean deploying essentially a crawler with agents and things like that, a lot of the things that mechanism is going to pick up on will be the things that end up having a real bearing. So of course there's the core compute, which you know for me at Intel is really interesting to talk about, and what resides in that compute. So not just what processor, but issues of operating system. Like I'm telling you, it's block and tackle, but it's amazing the extent to which just your OS can potentially actually accelerate your cloud journey. So if you're looking at an Azure, and Azure provides extended opportunity to run some operating systems. And so, that might give you the opportunity to migrate a little sooner than you thought. Or there are others that, might hold you back. So, from a runtime perspective, thinking down the road about additional functionality that you might want to add, the runtime or the application language, whatever it's been written in, may or may not be extensible enough to kind of
To
facilitate some of
allow.
the feature sets that you want. And so that kind of ends up pushing the rewrite conversation. But
I'm glad you brought the rewrite conversation up
yeah.
because there's a couple big things that people use when they do the migration. They do a lift and shift, most expensive kind, believe it or not, long term most expensive. They
Yep.
do a full rewrite. They do a re-architecture.
Mm-hmm.
Those are kind of the three big ones. And then I've seen some people play games with containerization, a containerized lift and shift. All you're doing is shifting the problem around. Um,
Yeah.
but it's good to know that you have lots of different tools and opportunities when you're looking at moving your workloads or your applications. It's not just one hammer. You've got hammers and screws and saws and nails and all those sorts of things.
That's right. There, and this is anecdotal. So my purview is really infrastructure, and so from a coding perspective, um, my depth isn't as it's not going to be as far down the line as I can go with infrastructure. But anecdotally, one of the things that I've seen that's actually wild is if you take really, really old applications. So data center exit, kind of going back to some of the key drivers of, a portfolio rationalization exercise, data center exit is a big one. If you have really old applications, there are times where if you put a wrapper around those, you potentially could containerize those and send them to the cloud. It's a Band-Aid, but it has worked for some organizations, which when you're in kind of a hurry can be actually
good.
really advantageous. Yeah.
Have you ever worked with teams where workloads and applications, you just said, you analyze them, you said, don't touch them, don't move them?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. What kind of what are the characteristics of those types of workloads typically? What do you typically find in those types of workloads?
Mm-hmm. So one of the chief advantages of the cloud, and I'm backing into your question. One of the chief
Okay.
advantages to the cloud is, agility, but what some people don't realize when they move to the cloud is agility is partially predicated on something that's fairly modular, and that's a little bit commoditized. In other words, if you have an application, small or large, in the data center that's so bespoke that to build the same kind of environment in the cloud, it becomes prohibitive after a while. So it's kind of like the house that you build where, we added a wing over here. So I love historical biographies. I'm reading Ron Chernow's biography on George Washington right now. And, Washington over the years, he added a little bit to Mount Vernon over here and the
Oh
little
yeah,
boat
yeah, he
over here.
did. Yeah.
And it was the finished product was beautiful, but was that something that would be likely to be re-architected somewhere else? Probably not. It was unique to Washington. And so those are the applications like that. It really is just better, unless you're in a situation where exit is an issue. Those really do better. So the more involved the dependency set and the more cross talking there is, and the more bespoke the stack that the application sits on, the more likely it is that it'd be better to say. A lot of folks will I have it some folks will kind of rip the Band-Aid off and pull the
Dive
cords
right
and go
in.
ahead and set it, and
It's
it
painful,
can
huh?
you can get through, but it's painful. Yeah.
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 So
Okay, so we did one end where, hey, I'm going to retain this on-prem. Which ones are the easiest ones that you look at and you go, we can move that in an afternoon, or we can move that
yeah.
in a couple of minutes? Which ones are on the other end of the spectrum where absolutely rehost, replatform that?
Yeah. So some of it has to do with the runtime. So if it's written honestly or in Java or Python, it's probably going to be a little easier, because some of that has to do with a byproduct of some of the architectural decisions that were probably made in the course of writing applications with those runtimes, and some of the versioning around Java and things like that can be helpful. So that's some of it. Just depending on the tech stack, technical debt, how much of it is there, particularly around the operating system, and how siloed is the application. So how much does it have to talk? Because you have to think about
Oh boy.
egress
Okay,
and
so I was going to
data
ask that next
gravity.
was,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, the data issue here. So if
Yeah.
it's siloed, meaning it's using its own data, it's really not grabbing data from anywhere else, it's a great target because I
Yeah.
don't have to worry about egress costs, which is a huge hidden, that's one of those
Yes, it
hidden
is.
costs, right?
Yes. And even if you buy a direct pipeline to and from the data center, it is possible to, hit overages. So it is better on the whole. Some organizations are really careful about allocating and watching their traffic over time. Like the network engineers can be real heroes in that situation. But it is better if it's siloed. So if you have something where you can serve up data to the application from an S3 bucket or a small, MySQL instance or what have you, those are super. Those need to be
They keep your costs down.
early.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I'm kind of surprised, but not too surprised that the cloud service providers have not changed their egress. Well, I know why they haven't. They're making tons of money doing it, right, and charging
Yes.
for it. But it's starting to create new architectures, right? It makes
Yes.
migrating some of these older applications much more difficult. If you didn't have that big egress charge, then migrating workloads would be a whole lot easier than it is.
Yeah. In fairness, even compared to a couple years ago. So I think this was in 2021, Azure in particular slashed their egress costs by a fair margin. And I think some of it was because they knew that they were reaching critical mass in terms of organizations' willingness to move workloads to the cloud, because they were looking at the egress sticker potentially going, how much are we really going to be paying here? Um, but having said that, it is a factor. So, and it depends on again with the industry, but having something sometimes like a unified file share where data is replicated back and forth between the cloud. Sometimes that's a way that organizations will get past it, or potentially even have a database instance that's cloud managed in the data center. And so, you're communicating with it in the data center, but from an egress perspective, if you have applications drawing on it in the cloud, that might be a little bit better way to go, because from a gravity perspective, at least it's sort of sitting right there.
Yeah, I've started seeing more of those architectures. Yeah, I call them almost like data diode architectures,
Hmm.
where the data resides in your data center and the information is just being pulled but never sent back. So
Yeah.
I run the stuff there and I send a small analyzed data back, but nothing ever comes back, which is
Yeah.
unnatural. It makes things more complicated and complex architectures.
It
All right,
does.
let's talk about compliance, because I know that's another big sneaky thing that shows up every once in a while when you start looking at application movement into the cloud. So, what sorts of things have you run in with regulatory compliance and cloud migration?
Yeah. Uh, I don't want to minimize the challenges of staying in compliance, because it takes quite a bit of time. But one of the things that I thought was kind of interesting in the Flexera State of the Cloud report, so that's something that I follow fairly carefully, just because they do a really good job of serving up the questions so that the information that comes back is fairly rich. Compliance is still a big issue, but it's inching down the list just a little bit. And I think there are a few reasons for that. One is that the cloud providers have gotten better over the course of time of helping customers architect so that they're in compliance. So the data centers, typically, depending on what you're looking at, like a HIPAA or a PII, SOC 1, SOC 2, those they will be optimized for the certification, and then the rest of it, the last mile, is up to you in terms of how you architect to stay in compliance. And I think they've gotten more active in some of the coaching there. Another thing that I think has helped is the ISVs who serve highly regulated industries uh, are making sure that their instances in the cloud, whether it's supporting discrete application or it's an actual COTS that the organization's running, they won't certify the environment unless it's architected according to their parameters.
All
So,
right, so that's really good. The cloud service providers
yeah,
are providing some really good tools and instances to help you stay in compliance when you're running in their stuff, which
yeah,
that could be a really good argument to move in, especially if you know you're not PCIe or PCI compliant. And you go, well, maybe I should just move my stuff into a PCI compliant instance,
Mhm.
right? That has logging and auditing and all the things that you need. That's a compelling argument right there.
Yeah, one industry specifically that I'm seeing this with, and I think it's so fascinating, is HLS, healthcare and life sciences.
Oh, really?
There's a lot of agitating to move more to the cloud and kind of encouraging a lot of the ISVs and providers who support that industry to get more cloud savvy. It used to be that it was really only just research, so clinical trials or artificial intelligence and machine learning around research or you know studies around different genomes. Genomic research drove a lot of it. Those are the sorts of things that used to be the only fit for
Right, right.
cloud in HLS. But you know the compliance piece and the fact that that friction has been reduced to some extent is actually a driver. And uh, it it makes sense in a way, because the I don't want to say the universal complacency, because that's far from fair. But in a highly regulated industry, if you think about an organization like an Equifax, there were patches they weren't keeping up with. There were updates that they hadn't done, and there was data that wasn't encrypted that should have been. That's basic blocking and tackling that should have been addressed. And from an audit trail perspective, that's the sort of stuff in the cloud that you can trigger an event with, and it gets sent back to a unified pane of glass, so somebody knows what door to knock on and say, wait a second,
Well,
that is not.
yeah, this is interesting that you brought it up, because what it tells me is when I do move things to the cloud, and even in the process of identifying all my applications, I'm going to uncover things.
Yes.
And one of the things the benefits of cloud, whether it's private cloud or public cloud, is I can universally across all my applications, across all the instances, I can apply changes more easily because I know where they're all at and I know the instances they're running on. So there's a lot of benefit to visibility into my data and my applications, primarily because they're running in a similar environment. Because
Yeah.
I know when I was a CIO, there was stuff running all over my data center. I had no idea what was running. And engineers would spin stuff up. I had no idea what was going on some of the times. And when I found out, I'd blow my top and say, what are you guys doing? You can't run game servers in our data center. You can't do it, right? And expose it to the outside world. No, you can't do that sort of stuff. Um, in the cloud, it's a lot easier to see. You have all that visibility.
Hmm. Well, it is, yes. The caveat I would offer is that it's kind of like hiding in plain sight. Sometimes,
Uh,
if you watch spy movies and stuff like that,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
sometimes they say the best place you can hide is in plain sight, and kind of camouflage yourself. That can be true, because when you're dealing with that much data, it may be visible, but interpreting it can be difficult. And so that's something else that you have to be prepared to tackle. And one of those aspects, again, going back to applications, is your tagging strategy. How disciplined is your organization about
In tagging
tagging? The
applications.
more,
Yeah.
yeah, the more compulsive the tagging behaviors, and by that I mean the stricter the organization about tagging, the more likely they are, I think, to be successful long term. And if they struggle with that, that's not to say that as a business they're not going to do great, but if the ship needs to turn it all, they're not really going to know what's underneath the surface. Is that a coral reef? Is that
Yeah,
just,
yeah,
are
yeah,
we
yeah.
in open
Yeah, it could
water?
be.
Are we? Yeah.
So,
So
so what you're telling me is I do all this great work in identifying all my applications and workloads and dependencies between them. I migrate, let's say I migrated everything to the cloud. I can't let my foot off of the visibility into everything. Otherwise, I can create the same spaghetti mess in the cloud, probably much faster in the cloud than I did in my data center.
That's exactly right. So the joke
Interesting.
used to be the joke used to be your mess for less about the cloud, because the promise of saving in the cloud, and then somebody I knew joked that it's really your mess for more. So if you'd like to pay more for your mess, go ahead. So, and having said that, uh, it is a paradigm shift, thinking top down about the application as opposed to bottom up.
It
So,
is.
but as long as an organization's prepared to do that, I mean, the opportunity is actually really, really exciting from an
Well, it
agility
sounds to me like an
perspective.
organizational change is needed. You need an application and workload czar that's watching
Yeah.
and doing that. Where before, hey, the applications are just mandated by the BUs, and we just handle infrastructure. That's
Mm-hmm.
right. So great lessons. Any last words for our listeners today? Any last advice you can give them on assessing their portfolio of applications and workloads?
Yeah. Technical debt. I'd like to tackle it from two ends of the stick. Technical debt is tough, but chipping at it away, the best way to eat an elephant is one bite at a time. And organizations that just slowly kind of go after technical debt over time can make real inroads. And sometimes you topple one domino and then the others go, which is great. And then for organizations who really have themselves wrapped around their tech stack for applications and know where their applications are, stay vigilant, because another emergence I'm seeing is that organizations that were savvy a couple years ago are now starting to actually experience technical debt in the cloud. So that's kind of encouraging, but also cautionary, because the cloud does make it somewhat easier to modernize. You still have to shift the things,
But I
but
can do it much faster
yeah,
because it's
that's right.
easier. It's easier to spin up new instances. I can get access to new capabilities in the cloud every day.
That's right.
So, Sarah, thanks for coming on the show. It's been wonderful as always. So I can't wait to talk to you again.
That sounds great. Thanks for having me, Darren.
Thank you for listening to Embracing Digital Transformation today. If you enjoyed our podcast, give it 5 stars on your favorite podcasting site or YouTube channel. You can find out more information about Embracing Digital Transformation at embracingdigital.org. Until next time, go out and do something wonderful.